and welcome to Scapa Flow, which is always an interesting thing to discuss, and broadly speaking, tends to create some very weird reactions. It's quite a fun thing when you bring it up, and I probably should now make sure to display to you exactly where I'm talking to you from. So, hello. Hello. So, this is going to be fun. I've tried to swap screens round, so instead of me staring off, hopefully this direction the whole time, apparently people find weird, because I tend to have my notes on the big screen there, and the screen which I'm watching the recording, and checking that's recording on the screen in front of me, I have swapped around. We'll see how it goes. We will see how it goes. I'm hoping it's going to be good. I think it should be good. I'm going to make sure that's as narrow as possible so I don't look all the way over there to see as things go on. Right then, Scapa Flow. How do I describe Scapa Flow? Usually, if you're going to find a place which has this much feeling when you walk into it, you are talking a site of a major land battle. You are talking a cathedral, you're talking a castle, you're talking something where you can feel the weight of the generations of history bearing down on you. And you can see it visibly. And it's not a bad thing to feel, it's just something you feel when you walk into them. You can feel the history around you. Scapa Flow gets most of that from a couple of events. It's a very interesting place. And one of the questions that's being asked is, what is its future? Well, its future at the moment is it's the world's first ship-to-ship transfer of liquefied natural gas took place there in 2007 between Excalibur and Excelsior of the Accelerate Energy group. And they also allow ship-to-ship transfer of crude oil there. It's a rather interesting place to go. Strange, but interesting in terms of that. You know, there is constant movement of things going on around there, but it really isn't much in terms of construction. Every time I've been there, it doesn't take much to imagine that you are the only person in the world. It really doesn't. In fact, it's very easy to imagine you are the only person in the world, especially if you're solo. I tend to go most places solo, so yes. It's fun. But it has a long history. Longer history than most people presume, because honestly, when I started doing the historical research, I knew it had been used as a roadstead and natural harbour a lot over the centuries. I knew academically that the Norwegians had used it. Harold Hardradason, Harold IV of Hardradason, the Fourth of Norway, had used it. One of Norway's longer reigning kings, and definitely one of the more powerful ones of the Viking Age. Also, the Earl of Montrose used it. And of course, HMS Montrose is one of my favourite frigates of all time. Mainly because I got to crawl around her when she was still being built. So there's lots of history there. Harkinson, I think. Not Harold Haraldsson. Norway and H names for kings. And of course, it's where the Kaiserlich Marine ends. It's where they cease to be. Some would say, in a brave attempt to deny their ships to the enemy. Others would say they fell victim to very, very creative and imaginative information warfare on behalf of the British, which meant that they dealt with a political problem without it becoming a massive problem. Instead of all these ships going to the various nations which wanted to line them up, they were all rendered useless. But that is some of the history. There's also been many attempts by submarines to enter the into Scapa Flow, but honestly, the one time they have managed to make it, that's the only time they managed to score a giant success, and then they had a very big impact because, let's be honest, Royal Oak was the one R class which had actually been upgraded into war time and would have actually been pretty darn useful. And it's often forgotten how much of an impact her loss has on the Navy's operations. Yes, she's only an R class, but she's the upgraded R class, and if you consider how many vessels have actually been upgraded, there are 2 Queens which haven't been upgraded. There are 2 Queens which have had less expansive upgrades, and one which has had the full upgrade, Warspite. Renown, Repulse. Well, Renown's been upgraded, Repulse hasn't, Hood hasn't. Nelson and Rodney are new. So once you start looking at going through, okay, how many ships have been upgraded? Oh, sugar. Upgraded ships that are fully upgraded in the 1930s. Royal Oak, Warspite, Sword of Queen Elizabeth, Sword of Valiant, and Renown. That's your 5. One of those is lost. That's a bigger loss than it sounds on paper when you're just going, it's an R class. Now, what am I quickly going to do? Well, I'm going to quickly talk about the Canada trip. And this is what all the money I am making through the YouTube channel is currently going to. Canada trip. Everything is going on the Canada trip. The reason being, I don't know when I'm going to get the opportunity to do it again. So I'm going to try and pack as much as we can. We are hoping to do Sullivan's and Little Rock. We are hoping to do Niagara Falls and the Canadian Aviation Museum. We are hoping to do Canadian National Archives and Museum of the Atlantic. We're hoping to do Sackville, Ottawa, and of course Haida, and and we're going to be doing all that. We're also have got dinner with the Canadian fans on the Saturday the 4th. But if there are American fans or fans from other countries who happen to be there and want to come along, you're more than welcome. Me and Drac have a similar policy in that we will say hello and talk to anyone who turns up. And it's the same when we're filming on Haida. As long as you don't mind waiting till we finish the filming, we are happy to chat. So if we're filming, we'll probably go do the bit to camera, then we'll stop the camera, and then we'll probably turn around and start answering questions. I sure hope we should probably warn the Haida crew about that. And the same will be the case on Sackville and Ottawa. Right. It's going to be fun. It's going to be fun, but that's what all the money is going towards. And by the way, there is a new button, and I'm going to admit this. This is the thing, because especially with academic contracts being what they were, I am going to point this out because it came up and I went, wow, that looks like a cool button. There's a super thanks button now, which is kind of like super chats, but for recorded videos. And I'm just going, how? There's also, of course, the usual subscribe, like. Please. Every little helps. Every little really does help. Because academia is proving more and more interesting as an employment route. Anyway, here is the geography of Scapa Flow. And it's also one of the reasons why it waxes and wanes in terms of importance. It's looked at several times during the Napoleonic Wars, but every time the Royal Navy goes, well, our enemies are all down here and off this way. Occasionally off that way, but there again, we have some fairly decent bases on the east coast of England to support it. Why do we need a base up there? You don't. The Scottish looked at a few times, the Scottish kings. But again, where was their major threat axis? What's the point of having a base up there if you only have a very small navy, which is what they did. They only had a very small navy. Tends to make you not have, a need for a distant port which you can turn into an infrastructure hub. And then we look at the relative infrastructure there. And even during World War I, when the Royal Navy are really putting a massive support there, quite a lot of the infrastructure is actually put around Scapa Flow, i.e. you find the floating dry docks are based at Invergordon, where you can get more supplies to them more easily. It makes sense. And Invergordon is slightly south of Scapa Flow. Just a tad. Just a tad. But here is the thing. If you're fighting Germany, and you want to stop Germany getting their ships out into the North Atlantic to threaten your convoys, then Scapa Flow suddenly becomes a very, very good base. Because instead of you doing a tail chase, you're chasing them from the east coast of the UK up after them, hoping to come together like that, it becomes, that scenario. Oh, you're coming out. We're coming straight down to you. Meeting engagement. Which sounds really like a very smart idea. It gets more problematic when you're dealing with Norway, because you're going straight and they're going up. But, life happens. And for the Arctic convoys, etc., it was a really good starting point to protection base on. So it's had uses. It's been useful. Pre-base usage. Well, as I said, Håkon IV Håkonsson, King of Norway. June 1217 to December 1263. Actually dies not far from there. He's come down to Scotland because he didn't like the Scottish kings trying to take off his Norwegian kingdom. Quite right. Never letting people take your kingdom, it's going to be problematic. Anyway, his son inherits after him, and he signs away the kingdom for a rather large amount of money, which I'm not sure if the Scottish ever actually finished paying for him. I do know that my family apparently nicked some of the chests of silver which were supposed to go to the Norwegian king, but, well, that's popular family myth, but... we weren't trying to start a war or anything, we were just after the money. Probably. Most likely. But if a war had happened, we'd have got paid by both sides, probably. Most likely. We tend to be quite good at that one. Yeah. And James Graham, the 5th Earl and 1st Marquis of Montrose. Now, Montrose is a very interesting officer, and someday, I've been doing the American Civil War. I've done a lot of their actions, because they often are riverine conflicts, and I can tie that into naval history. I'm going to have to try and do Montrose's campaigns in Scotland, because he is a very interesting and very capable general. And it is, broadly speaking, amphibious, we could say. Broadly speaking, if we define it widely. But really, the major pre-based usage of Scapa Flow is as an exercise area, where the Royal Navy go up and exercise ships quite regularly. It's a nice place to go. It's enough space you can manoeuvre. You can fire your guns. You can do your exercising. You can put your fleet up there for North Atlantic exercises. It's great. Not really anywhere they want to stay, though, because there is absolutely nothing. I mean... Scooby-Doo-Lulu. Not. Zilch. Zero. There is nothing to do. I mean, when they're up there in World War I, they build a golf course. That's how little there is to do. And they have to take it at a run because so many people want to do it, but it's such a short golf course. Definitely not pro-golf standards, okay? No. Respectable, I'm told, well, according to Jellicoe. But, not pro. So, really, what is the advantage of it? Well, it goes back to geography. It's its position. And the fact is, you can afford to have an exposed base without much infrastructure in that area because there is a lot of infrastructure not far away from it. That's a viable thing. Think about it. If your base has no infrastructure, well, that's going to keep your crews, basically all they're going to have to do while they're there is train, feed, and fuel their ships. That's all they've got to do, their time. So their ships are going to get really, really well trained. If you need to do something big with the ship, well, it doesn't have to go far. Just far enough that the crews, when they get there, are going to go, oh, we're in a place which has pubs. And probably, well, let's be honest, in World War One, you're in a place which has pubs and women. So yeah, but in the meantime, they were you kept the fleet at Scapa Flow and you kept them nicely trained, and also you could keep them away from politics. We didn't have time for politics up there. Great. The very big problems which Wilhelmshaven presents for the Kaiserlich Marine, i.e. the German fleet by the end of World War I, is so political, frankly, I'm surprised any of the officers escaped with their lives. Anyway, so what was the decision? Well, the decision was quite simple. The Royal Navy needed to be based somewhere up north. They had several choices. They could look at Invergordon, they could look at Rosyth, and honestly, both of those were lovely as maintenance facilities, but neither one was big enough for the fleet, which was going to be the size of the Grand Fleet. Plus, you'd be getting involved in the way of and involved with a lot of civilian facilities, which would be very expensive to move financially. So they chose Scapa Flow. And then in traditional British style, it's fitted for, not with. I.e., they've chosen Scapa Flow, that's where we're going to go. But, construction, they just basically hadn't done anything. And Invergordon and Rosyth weren't fortified, and let alone Scapa Flow actually fortified. So Jellicoe refused actually to use it as a proper base because of the possibility of submarine or destroyer attacks on the flow, until they had actually done some work. So actually, here is the reality. In 1914, if the Germans had come out to strike, they would have found most of the Grand Fleet was patrolling up and down the west coast of the British Isles. The west coast. But they didn't come out in time. They didn't get the intelligence, they didn't know what was going on, so they didn't come. And by the time they did come, Scapa had been defensively and decisively reinforced, including over 60 block ships sunk in the main entrance channels between the southern islands to enable the use of submarine nets and booms. And these approaches were then backed further by minefields, artillery, and concrete barriers. It was a long time coming, but it is pretty much the perfect place to blockade Germany from. It is. The only place better to blockade Germany from would be Copenhagen. Because then you could blockade the Baltic as well as the North Sea. But if you can't get Copenhagen, Scapa Flow will do. And it does do very well. Now, as I mentioned, there really wasn't much at the base. There is a golf course, some supplies, and facilities for loading those supplies. There are special trains which bring coal, and there are other systems put in place to supply oil the ships. And one of the reasons why, honestly, they are happy to move 5th Battle Squadron to Rosyth to back up the battlecruiser force is because of getting oil up to Scapa Flow. Scapa Flow itself, as you can see, it is this sort of collection of islands where they fortify the gaps between. And they try and make it as difficult for submarines as possible to get in. They do quite well. First World War. Second World War, as we know, a submarine does get in. One, but it causes a legacy. Because it does get a really, really cool target. A really critical one. Now, the fleet normally would be anchored down in the sort of the southern bit. And they would usually in the southwestern corner of it, as we're looking at that map. And they would have a sort of firing range from the northwestern corner to the southeastern corner. The idea being, you probably shouldn't miss and hit then. I think you're not supposed not to be shooting that. So that's helped them get some target practice in. Then they'd have maneuvering practice and various other things going on. So it's a big space. It is a really big space. And that's helpful. But it's not a place you'd want to be posted. It's really not. It's not the sort of place you go, I want to be posted there. It would be up there with some of the more interesting bases in Alaska, probably South Georgia. You know, it's a case of it's beautiful countryside, it's absolutely spectacular scenery, wonderful wildlife. Can we please go home after 4 weeks because we're now bored? But don't worry, your friendly, helpful Chief Petty Officer or Lieutenant Commander has an idea just for you because you're bored. Let's do some more exercise. Let's go shoot the guns some more. Let's clean the ship after we've coaled it. Let's clean the ship after we fired our guns because we've got dust everywhere. Let's clean the ship. Let's paint the ship. Let's go do more shooting. It's good. It's good for quality. It's not necessarily good for long-term morale, but they survive. And as I point out, life of the ground fleet is fairly decent. Things could have been a lot worse. And the ground fleet really did understand that. They didn't get the opportunities to fight that they would like. But the constant exercising, the constant training, the constant drills, the constant working through things, that has an impact. It allows them to reach a really fine degree of quality. And this can be seen in some of the operations that can take place in North. And let's be honest, Jutland. The deployment into the line. Twice, Jellicoe pulls it off. Twice, he leaves it to the last minute. And it gets pulled off pretty much as seamlessly as you can when you're dealing with 20,000 ton plus objects, which are literally floating in a liquid, and so cannot really brake or do any version of a handbrake turn. Yeah, it's pretty good. The first submarine that made an attempt to enter was U-18, which tried it in November 1914. Unfortunately, it bumped into a trawler, which decided to ram her, force her to leak, and prompted her to surface, abandon ship, and one crew member died. UB-116, well, that isn't actually UB-116, that's one of her sisters, but we'll leave that to one side. Tried to make the attempt in October 1918. However, by this point, there were far more sophisticated defences in place rather than a trawler bumping into you. Although the trawler bumping into you had been jolly effective. It was detected by the hydrophones. I mean, so useful to have had working, I don't know what to do. Before it entered the anchorage, and so was destroyed by shore-triggered mines, which killed all 36 sailors aboard. Rather cruel if you think about it for a submarine. I'm sneaking in. I can hear you. You're going to be close to these mines. I'm not going to hit them or set them off any other way, but I'm going to. Boom, boom. Bye-bye. We talk about today the effect of drone warfare and its effect on the human psyche, being able to kill someone remotely without risking theoretically anything yourself. We've been doing a long time. A long, long time. It's not... What's new is the scale of it, necessarily not the actual act of it. So, the interning. Well, if I told you that the Royal Navy was usually based somewhere in the south of that position, and the firing range started somewhat to the north of that position, then you get an idea of why the Germans are put in that position. Because the Royal Navy can very easily decide it's going to split itself in half, and the Germans go, well, why are you doing it? But they're going to our firing range, and this is where we normally anchor. It works, but yeah. It's not exactly the nicest way to do things, but it's a practical, and frankly, you're not in the business of being nice, you're in the business of winning a war. And again, it's in June 1919, after 7 months of waiting, that the Rear Admiral Ludwig von Ruyter decides to scuttle the fleet because the negotiation period for the treaty had elapsed and he had received no word of settlement. He had not been kept informed that there had been a last-minute extension to finalize details, information management. Okay. One of those key reasons for that extension was because there were arguments going over who was going to get which ships. Then, you know what, after making sure he didn't get the information, the British fleet left on an exercise. The bulk of the British fleet wasn't there. So, he had no information, and then he was given no information, so he had motive. And the bulk of the British fleet had left, so he therefore would have means, and the British would have deniability. Well, have opportunity, and of course he always had means. In fact, the German ships have spent most of the last few months preparing for the order, welding bulkhead doors open, laying charges in vulnerable parts of their ships, and quietly dropping important keys and tools overboard so valves could not be shut. Amazingly, Baden, Emden, Nuremberg, and Frankfurt, plus 18 destroyers, the ones which the Royal Navy were quite keen on getting a good look at, were the ones which the Royal Navy managed to beach and save. Turns out they had crews in the right position for that. "53 ships, the remainder of the High Seas Fleet, were sunk. 9 German sailors died on some of these ships when the British opened fire to try and prevent scuttling. These are quite probably the last casualties of World War One, unless we consider World War Two to be a continuation of World War One, or I suppose the Russian Civil War, which several nations did consider a continuation of World War One, we consider to also be a continuation. It then, of course, leads to a massive salvage operation, which is another boon for the British economy. It's just terrible, how this unfortunately happened. Look, I'm not saying there's an actual plan going on. Honestly, we found no proof of that over the years. But I will say it's so convenient it stinks to high heaven. Okay, I'm not saying... There is a difference, and I have noticed some people do sometimes seem to not quite get this difference, between thinking the British are some sort of godlike masters who manage to control and manipulate the universe, and thinking that sometimes that sure do work out the British way. Who would have planned this sort of operation? Well, you'd be looking at some of the British secret services, etc. But again, it's a level of manipulation. Taking the Grand Fleet to sea that day for exercises. Making the decision to cut off information. All these things on their own are perfectly logical and reasonable. When taken all together, you have set up a situation where you can't be certain what the Germans will do, because there's always the chance that the Germans don't do it. But you've led the horse to water. And I am just about cynical enough about my own country and our history to think that is not beyond the realms of possibility of someone thinking about. Because the other option you've got is if all ships hadn't been lost and all ships had been saved or hadn't been scuttled and had been handed over, the British then have to deal with the Americans, the French, the Italians, getting a load of German battleships. So there goes your ability to get rid of your older battleships and get a peace dividend. There goes your ability to actually have any arms control treaties, because I'm sorry, that ain't happening. Under those circumstances where everyone's suddenly got so many more ships, the British will be building. The Americans might go, well, we don't need to build, we've got a whole load of German ships. But they'd be building. It just wasn't a good idea. And as you can see, there's on this map, it's sort of the anchorage, fleet anchorage, and the anchorage for ships exercising and torpedo range. That's pretty much how it's used for the interwar years. The fleet turns up there. Every now and again, it has an exercise. It uses as a base for various exercises. But honestly, it's not really at the front of things. It's not really at the front of things. And really, they don't have much money put into defense, in defending it. Let's put it this way. To say the First World War era defenses had fallen into disrepair is to be highly polite about the fact that no one had done any maintenance at all whatsoever under any circumstances. In fact, frankly, it wasn't so much they'd fallen into disrepair as they had just not been repaired. They had just collapsed. I often use the example of Singapore, but you could pretty much go through every major British fortification or defensive position around the world and go, none of them have been properly looked after in the war period. Let me re-emphasize that. None of them have been properly looked after during the interwar period. Not a single one. That's what comes from believing your own Kool-Aid. Or no, drinking the Kool-Aid or believing your own propaganda. I'm not sure. Actually, no, I am going to combine them. Drinking your own, believing your own Kool-Aid. They believed they'd fought in the war to end all wars, so they told themselves they didn't need to do these things. There will be no more war. So you don't need to prepare for war. Think when else that has been said. Oh yes, the end of the Cold War. There'll be no more war. There's a peace to that end. There'll be no more war. There'll be no more war. It's a dream, and it's a good dream, and it's one every historian like me who studies this stuff would love. We'd love for our work to be academic. For it to be this pure, this pursuit of just knowledge. But the reality is, the world is always going to have greedy. It might not always have needy people. It might not always have people who are starving. We can hope for that. We can hope to end poverty. We can hope to end a lot of these things if we can, provide enough food and provide enough water and actually make the world function in that sort of respect. And you can do some sensible things for those. Some very sensible projects could be done. Especially if you're looking to sort of link up, I don't know, green energy with the ability to desalinate the seawater to turn it into drinking water and all those things. There are some very sensible things, options there. And once you've solved the drinking water problems, you can then solve quite a lot of other issues. But leaving that all to one side, the fact is you're unlikely to stop wars happening. Ever. Because there are always humans who believe they should be more powerful than others. And believe their way is the best way. And people who disagree with them. Or people who think the exact same way, but they think their way is the best way, not the other person's way is the best way. And situations can degenerate into war disturbingly quickly. People believing they have no other choice. Because the other choice, other than war, would be them backing down and admitting they got something wrong. And they're never going to do that. So, World War II begins. This is what the defences looked like by 1941. 2 years into the war. They look good by that point. You can see a small issue sitting off at various points. If we look at here, you can see where Jon Gulfer manages to get his Gunther Prince managed to get in U-47 into Scapa Flow. Do you know what's really annoying about the attack? And we'll be getting in that is he launched it twice. But as you can see, they've put boom defenses and anti-torpedo defenses, block ships. They've sunk in. They have various guard loops, indicator loops, anti-boat nets, all those things. The anti-boat nets, etc. There are various things which should have been sunk to prevent U-47 getting in and getting out. Those aren't there when U-47 goes in and goes out. They're just not. Heavy AA guns. Here is the thing. I'm doing a lot of history about treaties at the moment at various studies, and I'd like to point this one out before I get into this, because I might not get a chance in live to point this out. There is nothing in the treaties which limit you to putting in defences in your home ports and your home defence positions. Nothing in them. No at all. So this is entirely saving money. And if you think you could have spread it out and just kept the maintenance and a little bit of an upgrade going on year in, year out for over 20 years, you would have probably spent a lot less money than you had to crash spend in the middle of war when there's massive and rampant inflation going on. So you could have actually saved money and had better defences and not lose one of your precious upgraded capital ships. There are also causeways constructed to block the eastern approaches of Scapa Flow, and they're built by Italian princes of war who were held in Orkney. They also built, of course, the Italian chapel, and they're called the Churchill Barriers, which now provide road access from the mainland to Bury and South Romsey. Which is nice. And there's also an airbase built. RAF Grimstead, later HMS Robin, commissioned in 1940. Anyway, here is the loss of Royal Oak, and here is the really disturbing thing. So, he goes in. He launches a spread of torpedoes. He misses! He realizes no one is pursuing him. No one has even noticed. No one knows he's there. So he goes back and launches another set. An admiral's lost. All the crew are virtually all the crew are lost. It's a nightmare. And did I mention it's one of the few upgraded capital ships? Did I mention that? I'm not sure if I did. He gets round the World War I era block ships, which are still sitting there. Some of them have actually been moved by the Navy to make it more accessible for them during exercises in the 20s and 30s. And because they were actually areas, which suggests you need to start replacing them with something if you're going to be able to use it again. But remember, one of the things you have to remember is, again, and I will go on this, is that the Royal Navy, much of the 1920s and 30s, the likely opponent in any future naval war was the Japanese, followed by the Italians. The Germans didn't really feature till after they started doing a build-up, and Hitler had managed to get the power. Prior to that point, no. If you'd suggested in 1930 that we were going to be at war with Germany within a decade, people would have looked at you and gone, huh? People who were saying that were being written off as idiots, as insane. And no one really was saying that. It gets different by 1935. By 1937, it's even more so. But even in 1939, as I've been over several times, the Royal Navy are actually pointing guns at the Japanese, and the Japanese are pointing guns back at them. That looks like the more risky scenario. However, the British aren't prepared in the Far East either, arguably, so can't even use that as an excuse for them not preparing Scapa Flow. And honestly, preparing Scapa Flow would have been sensible, along with preparing Singapore and Ceylon, or Trim commonly at least, and a few other places around the world. It would have been sensible to make sure there was heavy AA already installed in Malta at various positions, because it's so critical in the middle Mediterranean, dealing with the Italians. But the thing is, you can never say with absolute certainty what the next war will be. You can't. Which is why you have to worry about people who do predict they say they can. Because they're usually talking out of not their mouth. What you can say are what the likely options are. So preparing for war in the Far East is sensible, because Japan looks like the most likely option. And they, to be fair, the Royal Navy isn't wrong. They do end up at war with Japan. It's just 1941 when that starts, whereas the war with the Germans starts in 1939. And the 10-year rule had been ended informally in 1932. In practice, had been ended properly in 1936. So really, the Royal Navy was expecting war 1942 to 1946, because that was the 10-year rule they'd been held to by the Treasury. But I'm still not sure where the 10-year rule comes into. We're not going to make sure there's funding being allocated to maintaining proper bases and defences. But I suppose for the Admiralty, their choice was between maintaining their ships, which they need whichever war it was in, or maintaining the bases, which they didn't know which war they were going to be using, and hoping they get the time in peacetime before war began to upgrade those defences. They didn't, and they lost one of the ships they spent a lot of money on. Remainder of World War II, it's a critical place. This is Scapa Flow in 1942. And yeah, I have to admit I've left it in sort of black, the writing, but there's a reason for that. There's USS Wasp in the centre there. There is the heavy cruiser Wichita. There is the USS Washington. There is HMS Victorious. And I'm reckoning it's probably Duke of York, but it could be King George V. But around the time this photo was taken, King George V was running across HMS Punjabi. So, yeah. But that's quite a scary and formidable task force you're dealing with. A British carrier, an American carrier, a British fast battleship, an American fast battleship, and an American cruiser, and a whole plethora of destroyers in the distance. And that's the sort of force you need to retain in Scapa Flow in case the Germans send out heavy equipment to attack the Arctic convoys. This is the Arctic Convoy Protection Force. That would scare the bejesus out of me if I was a German battleship. Going, you, and you, you, and you. And again, the Germans don't really try again on Scapa Flow. They always retain it as an idea, but every time they sort of look into it, they decide, not a good idea now. Lots and lots of defences. Lots and lots of defences. Post-World War II to present day. Well, mostly it's being used by the energy industries. Petroleum, liquefied natural gas. It's got a lot of history. It's got a whiskey distillery there, and it's got scuba diving. During the Cold War period, it was occasionally used again as a fleet base, but very rarely, mainly because the infrastructure of supporting ships and the size of fleet. You needed Scapa Flow when you were supporting a massive fleet, because it had the space for a massive fleet. When you don't need the massive space, well, you use other spaces. You do use other options you've got in Scotland, and especially when you're looking at far more of a Cold War operation. But it gets more interesting as time goes on. As time goes on in the future, we have to consider, what is it? Well, probably it's going to continue to be used for energy and transfers, and it's going to be used for what it is as it is currently. However, we have no idea what's going to happen next with our friends in Russia, or rather, our fellow humans in Russia. Ukraine, and you can see Crimea on this map, so you can work out where roughly Ukraine is does not seem to be going well at all. And it's looking more and more like Russia is going to be facing a far more belligerent future. Now the trouble is, the whole hope had been, I think, many people, long term, to try and balance out China and Russia by playing off against each other. Instead, one has managed to put itself in a position where we can't really engage with it to the same level. And the other is also complicated to engage with. Because let's be honest, one looks to be attempting some very, very nasty things in Ukraine. And from the large numbers of mass graves which keep being found, attempting something pretty nasty. And the other one seems to be. Not necessarily mass graves, but cultural genocide, if we're going to use that word. But that is a complicated and loaded word, as I'm told regularly. It's scary. So what's the future for Scapa Flow? Well, it's one of those very safe and very useful anchorage spaces to bring ships into in sort of the north of the UK. It's a fairly safe space because it's under quite a lot of defensive umbrellas. And I think if you are talking operating carrier battle groups, etc. up there, it's a space you can bring in and you can secure. Why does that matter? Well, it comes down to loading VLS. You need cranes. Big cranes for it. And you could put a floating crane in there that could quite happily do the VLS reloading and restocking. And it's far enough away from main ports that if someone does launch an attack and set something off, you're not going to be looking at a big potential disaster. So I think it's there as an option. I don't think it's going to be a major fleet base, but I think it could end up being a resupply base. And I also think you have to start thinking these through. I think the big lesson of Scapa Flow is that every time it's been needed, it hasn't been prepared in any way, shape, or form. So either you have to start having some form of temporary basing stuff that you can throw into a place quickly and have to repair it so you can fly it wherever you need it in the world, or you have to start doing some actual preparations of peacetime. And these days that could be fairly simple, you know. Heavy AA tends to mean what? Well, we need some concrete, probably for the SAM batteries, etc. to set up on. Okay. Want to put some random concrete around Scapa Flow? You can probably get away with it. Yeah, someone will notice. But they ask what you're doing. Oh, we're putting in turning circles for trucks. Supporting the energy industry. Right, what have we got coming up? Well, we have got the county class in War in Retrospect coming up on Tuesday. We have... I think it's Tuesday. Wednesday. Yeah, Tuesday. We have I'm sure it's not Admiral Mascu. I think that's the wrong one. I'm fairly sure it's Elzbieta of the Romanian Navy, because I decided to change cruisers. Then we got the Galaxy class. Then we got Boadicea class. And then we have all the Washington treaties. And all the Equitable London Treaty. The Equitable London Treaty is going to be a fun one. Right. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. And again, thank you for all your support. Thank you for all your liking, subscribing, sharing. Thank you for all the super chats, all the patron subscribers, all the support. Without what you were doing, I wouldn't be able to do half the stuff I'm doing. Thank you very much, and take care. Oh, and question. Because I am finishing these videos with a question now. What would be your thing you would like to see put into some sort of mobile basing system that you could set up somewhere? How would you do it? Would you want a containerized system? What things do you think should be in it, in such a containerized transportable basing system? How would you put it together? You know, think it through. You're going to need probably power generation. You're probably going to need sanitation, accommodation. You're going to need surveillance. You're going to need defenses. You're going to need all sorts of things. I'd really like to see what people's thoughts are on this and what you could do and whether you could do it. Thank you very much. Take care and hope you enjoyed.